At the age of 42, David realized he had become a ghost in his own life, invisible to the world and even to himself, utterly lost. There was no career left, no respect from others, and no voice to speak his truth as the weight of failure pressed down on his weary soul. The world had begun to ignore him because he had first ignored his own potential, letting his discipline slip away until everything finally crumbled into dust. When the people you love stop seeing you as a man of value, the silence that follows is louder than any argument you could ever win. He looked into the glass and saw a stranger, a man who had traded his dreams for comfort and his strength for the safety of mediocrity. Every door had closed, every bridge had burned, and now he stood at the absolute bottom of a pit he had dug with his own hands. The darkness was not just outside, it was a heavy shroud that had settled over his mind, making every step forward feel like a desperate struggle. He realized that if he did not change now, this silence would be the only thing left to define the remaining years of his hollow existence. But within that crushing silence, a tiny spark of defiance began to flicker, a whisper of the man he used to be before life broke him. He decided that he would no longer be a victim of his circumstances, but the architect of a new and much more powerful version of himself. It was time to kill the man he was to make room for the man he needed to become. Starting with a single, drastic and necessary act, he disconnected from the noise, the fake validation, and the constant distractions that had kept him prisoner in a cycle of endless, unproductive and empty dopamine. The first rule of his new life was absolute clarity. No more escaping into bottles or numbing the pain that was meant to fuel his growth. The second rule was isolation. He would no longer compare his behind-the-scenes struggle to the curated highlights of people who didn't even know he existed. Monk mode was not a punishment, it was a revolution in silence. A sacred contract signed in the dark to reclaim his stolen and scattered focus. While the rest of the world slept, David began his climb, waking up at the hour of the wolf to face his inner demons with courage. Every knot tied in those laces was a commitment to movement, a promise that he would never again stand still while his life passed him by. The cold air burned his lungs, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the mental agony he had endured for so many long years. He used the freezing water to shock his system back to life, washing away the lethargy and the excuses that had kept him weak for decades. In the quiet of his room, he created a sanctuary of focus, where the only thing that mattered was the evolution of his own complex mind. He sought wisdom from the ancient masters of self-control, learning that a man's worth is measured by his ability to govern his own chaotic impulses. He began to realize that his outer world was merely a reflection of his inner state. And to change his life, he must change himself. Stillness became his greatest weapon, a way to observe his fears without being consumed by them, building a fortress of peace inside his very soul. Isolation is the heavy price of greatness, but it is a price he was now more than willing to pay to achieve his ultimate personal freedom. He nourished his body with the same discipline he applied to his mind, understanding that a strong spirit requires a strong and healthy physical vessel. The transformation was no longer a dream, it was a daily grind. A series of small victories that were slowly adding up to something massive. He forged his body in the heat of the iron, turning soft tissue into hard muscle through the relentless application of grit and agonizing sweat. Each representative was a rebellion against the man who used to give up. A declaration that the old David was dead and gone forevermore. He learned to love the pain because it was the only thing that felt real. The only thing that proved he was finally moving forward again. The mirror no longer showed a victim. It showed a warrior who had fought himself and won. Emerging from the darkness with a hardened body. While others were out seeking temporary pleasure, David was building his empire in the quiet hours, mastering skills that would soon make him truly indispensable. He studied the laws of money and the psychology of the market. turning himself into a precision instrument of logic in a world of pure chaos. Discipline is the highest form of self-respect. He chose his long-term vision over short-term social validation, knowing that the right people would eventually follow. His face had changed, losing the softness of indecision and gaining the hard edges of a man who knows exactly where he is going in life. He learned to channel his aggression into productive action, turning his inner fire into a controlled burn that fueled his relentless pursuit of personal excellence. In the shadows, he became his own greatest opponent, constantly pushing the boundaries of what he thought was possible for a man of his age. He mastered his emotions, refusing to be a slave to the self-pity that had once held him captive, choosing instead the path of the stoic. The temptations that once pulled at him now felt like distant echoes, having no power over a man who had found a much greater purpose. He had become a predator of his goals, stalking his future with a quiet intensity that only comes from months of deep, uninterrupted and silent work. The storms of life continued to rage outside, but inside his room, there was only the steady rhythm of a man rebuilding his entire broken world. The long night of his soul was finally ending, and the dawn was bringing with it the rewards of a discipline that few would ever understand. He stepped back into the world, not as a seeker, but as a creator, launching his vision into a marketplace that rewards value above all else. The market began to respond to the version of David that he had meticulously built, and his value started to rise at an exponential rate daily. When you upgrade your inner self, your outer world naturally adjusts to match your new frequency, drawing in opportunities and people of much higher quality. He moved with the grace of a man who knows his worth, no longer asking for permission to exist but simply taking his rightful place. His presence now commanded the room before he even spoke a word, a testament to the months of silence and suffering he had endured alone. The very people who would have ignored him a year ago were now leaning in to hear his ideas, captivated by his undeniable and raw authority. He valued his time more than anything else, knowing that it was the most precious resource he had used to buy his current and hard-earned success. The world was suddenly knocking at his door, desperate for a piece of the man who had the courage to disappear and recreate himself entirely. It was a quiet triumph, a victory that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops because it was written in the very way he stood. He was no longer a shadow in the crowd. He was the sun, a center of gravity that pulled the world toward his new and improved reality. Even the smallest interactions were different now, colored by the immense self-respect he had cultivated during his long and difficult journey through the dark. He no longer needed the digital noise to feel alive, having found a much deeper and more permanent source of validation from within his own heart. The attention of others was a natural byproduct of his growth, but he remained focused on his path, no longer easily swayed by mere temporary beauty. He had learned that the most attractive thing a man can possess is a mission that he is unwilling to compromise for anything or anyone else. The market had corrected itself. His external reality had finally caught up to the internal giant he had awakened during his long months of monk mode. He returned to the circles that once pitied him, not to seek revenge, but to walk as a man who had truly mastered his own destiny. There was no anger in his heart, only a cold and polite indifference that spoke volumes more than any angry words ever could have done. She saw a version of him she never thought possible, a man of power and purpose who no longer needed her validation to feel whole and complete. His words now carried the weight of experience, the gravity of a man who had been to hell and back and brought the fire with him. The past was a closed chapter, a necessary teacher that he had finally outgrown, leaving behind the ghosts of his former failures with every confident step. He was the architect of his own legend, a living example of what happens when a man decides to stop making excuses and start making progress. True power is not something you demand, it is something you embody. A frequency that others can feel even if they don't know your story. He remembered the man who wanted to give up on this very bridge. And he felt a deep, soul-stirring gratitude for the pain that saved him. The greatest revenge is a life well lived, a success so loud that it drowns out every whisper of doubt from the people who once doubted you. He was now building bridges to the future, surrounding himself with other giants who understood the value of the struggle and the price of victory. He had become unignorable because he had first become undeniable to himself, proving that it is never too late to reclaim your lost and stolen throne. He stood at the summit of his own mountain, looking down at the path he had climbed with nothing but his own 2 hands and unyielding will. The city hadn't changed, but he had, and that was all that mattered in the grand and complex theater of a man's long and winding life. He was the master of his soul and the captain of his fate. A king without a throne who had finally found his home within himself. Freedom was no longer a destination, it was his state of being. A prize won in the silence of his room and the heat of his struggle. The question is not whether the world will see you, but whether you are brave enough to disappear until you are worth being seen by everyone. Your monk mode begins the moment you decide that your potential is more important than your comfort. And your future is more important than your past. Join us on the path of self-mastery. Subscribe to Psychegen and begin your journey toward becoming the most powerful version of yourself today and every day. HENV Gap Lai Ban O Phian Ban Man Mi Hun Kua Chin Min. The world is waiting for the man you are about to become.